Hi folks, I'm making this video as the first in a series. I haven't planned the rest of the series yet, but this is just an introduction to ideas before going a bit more in depth later. Lots of people have talked about decolonising the curriculum lately. It was a phrase that came out of original wave of Black Lives Matter protests in the US in 2015. The UK National Union of Students ran a 2016 campaign, "Why is my curriculum white?" As I've covered in a previous video, the traditional repertoire of classical music falls into this pattern. Interest in decolonisation has been paralleled by shock headlines. Universities ban Chaucer, cancel Beethoven, which have made a lot of people angry. Generally, those takes ignore the nuance and almost all of the substance of decolonisation campaigns. In this video, I'm going to attempt to summarise what decolonisation means, what it might mean for music in universities. In her TED talk, Decolonisation is for Everyone, Nikki Sanchez says, "This history is not your fault, but it is your responsibility." That means not only that those who still benefit from colonialism should still talk about it, but also those in positions of power, whatever power that might be. My position outright. I'm a junior scholar with no permanent position, so I don't have large amounts of power to change things, and the obvious, I'm a white guy with all the privileges that go with that position. And I'm building on trying to read and reference the work of hundreds of scholars and musicians from black and ethnically diverse backgrounds. I am, though, in a position to start conversations, even if just with colleagues and students, and to try and encourage more people to think about these vital questions. I want this series to be a conversation, so please get in touch if you've got comments or ideas. So here goes.
Look in my eyes, what do you see? A cult of musicology.
Okay, let's talk colonialism. When we speak of classical music, often with the prefix Western in front of it, we're generally talking about music composed from roughly 1600 to the present day in Central European countries, possibly including America and Russia. I generalise heavily, of course, but it's basically true. If you know your colonial history, you'll know that almost this exact same time, these same countries were going out colonising other countries, largely, but not exclusively, in the global south, terrorising and enslaving their people, stealing and exploiting their natural resources. What empires, you say? Well, there's Portugal, Spain, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Ottomans, Russia, Denmark, Italy, Sweden, and the big one, Britain. In each of these, people from European countries travelled to other nations and said, "This is mine." In Dan Hicks's book, The Brutish Museums, he outlines how colonialist theft becomes a kind of cultural production for those countries. What kind of a mode of production is theft? Clearly it involves objects, but also images, the act of putting pen to paper, whether drawing a map, filling out an accession register, or writing this book can represent an act of taking. Clearly, if it is in any way generative, it is a mode of cultural production that is predatory, beginning with the most extreme and dangerous forms of what we today call cultural appropriation. The European condition and way of life was assumed to be a kind of universal good by these colonialists, be it in terms of trading, religion, social order, etc. It could be applied to every country in the world for their own betterment, and the treasures of the colonised could be stolen and exported back to Europe. Okay, I'm not going to give a detailed history of colonialism. Suffice it to say that nations that were colonised did not come out well from the arrangement. For example, over 250 years, India's share of the world economy went from 24.9% in 1700 to just 4.2% in 1950, all because of British colonialism. Okay, most of the empires were dismantled by the mid-20th century. Slaves were freed, slave trade officially banned, people emancipated. What does this have to do with teaching classical music in the 21st century? Well, a lot, actually. Very traditional models of teaching classical music state outright that European classical music speaks to the human condition, a kind of universal language. Interesting that it's always a European language that's a universal one, right? This attitude of universalism results in a curriculum that places special value on European music and presents everything else as something other. It's a miniature version of the colonizer and the colonized. But aren't we beyond colonialism?
We've long had the term post-colonialism, a broad term to describe scholarly work that examines just how colonialist structures survive into our modern era, and how institutions continue to benefit from the privilege that put them where they are today. What isn't clear across different post-colonialist perspectives is what we do about this, and that is how decolonisation is different. Again, I generalise, and there's lots of fantastic work done out there.
Okay, what's the alternative? This is where decolonisation comes in. Decolonisation opts to recognise where colonial structures exist and to explain how they operate. Note the present tense there. We don't assume that colonialism is over, since the power structures that benefited from it are very much still in place today. It doesn't mean getting rid of anything that already exists in classical music curricula. We can still have Beethoven, Schubert, Handel and the whole gang, but our conversations need to be bigger. Okay, like what? Often, when we encounter diversity in the music curriculum, it's through ethnomusicology, the branch of scholarship that, broadly conceived, studies music in an ethnographic kind of way, often outside the European art tradition, not always. That's all fine and well, but in some ways it reinforces that non-European music is something separate, that should not be considered at the same time as European music. Note there's lots of work actually being done along those lines outside of it, but I'm generalising, so forgive me. To compartmentalise music along these lines is still to observe the structures of coloniality. What's worse, if we opt only to diversify our idea of canon in classical music without interrogating what it means to have that canon, we also risk supporting colonial structures still. Alejandro L. Madrid writes, "Inclusion of Ibero-American music in the musical canon or the musical curriculum seems to be a matter of diversity understood as tokenism. Such a move seeks to open spaces because it is the politically correct thing to do. It is about quotas, not about challenging nature that diverse experiences may bring to the very structures music academia has taken for granted for decades. This type of diversity does little to change the current critical situation of music academia and the humanities, instead perpetuating the delusional idea that everything is all right and we just need to add some new spices to the dish we have." I think that people who wish to diversify existing structures are well-intentioned. Of course I do. And as you see, I think this is an important step. But decolonising the music curriculum is more than tokenism. Tokenism doesn't challenge power structures. It confirms them. In my understanding, as someone just new to exploring this topic, decolonising classical music history is to A. Acknowledge and discuss the colonialist power structures that put European music in its position of privilege. So we recognise where unfair power dynamics exist, where classical music presents itself as universal, etc. Following that, we discuss how representation and diversity can and should be incorporated into this story. We can and should talk about composers from ethnically diverse backgrounds like Samuel Coleridge Taylor, Florence Price, and Julius Eastman. Following that, we then ask what it even means to put value in this story in our modern era, that is the canon. We ask ourselves, what should we do once we recognise this colonialism in our curriculum? What can we do to change it? Okay, what's an example of this kind of framework in a curriculum? Well, in teaching 18th century classical music topic theory, I might A. discuss how European interactions with the Ottoman Empire shaped and reinforced attitudes of Orientalism in, say, how Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven characterised a Turkish march. B. I might then explore how music practices around Turkey and the Ottoman Empire and Janissary bands and neighbouring countries actually took place at that time, and how exchange was facilitated with European traders and diplomats. C. I then might reflect with students in a group why would we encounter Turkish music of this era via Mozart at all? In other words, encourage students to think of the reverse. Would I teach Mozart in this tangential way if I was teaching a course, The History of Turkish Music? And so on. It's not a perfect model by any means. but it's a beginning for thinking about decolonisation in the music curriculum. We're not getting rid of anyone. No one's getting cancelled. I think we also need to be brutally honest with ourselves and each other. We can't pretend that music theory from the 18th century is universal to all music. And we shouldn't pretend that. Okay, many universities have courses focused exactly on that. What can they do? Well, we should be upfront about it. We say, we are studying 18th century music theory. It is complex and very particular to this music, and it doesn't apply widely beyond it. We can still teach it, enjoy it, but we present it with honesty, and it leaves us more room to teach other kinds of theory. By expanding, we're bringing more to the table. We're raising more questions than before. Questions for discussion, consideration, questions that encourage broader change. We should note that decolonisation of curricula right now is a process, but it's also a metaphor. As Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang have pointed out, decolonisation is actually a physical process of repatriating lands, reimbursing lost wealth, returning cultural objects, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. In other words, we shouldn't comfort ourselves for being good progressive citizens when we decolonise our music curricula, if, at the same time, we neglect and ignore the very real political and physical acts of decolonisation that need to be taking place at the same time. Okay, I'm going to leave it here. There's so much more to say on this, and we will. That's why this is intended to be a series. In future videos, I'm going to present case studies, hopefully discuss with prominent scholars in this field, and expand this way beyond this little introduction. Okay? So thank you for watching. Please share any comments or thoughts you might have, like and subscribe for more videos, and I'll see you next time.
Look in my eyes, what do you see? A cult of music.